Welcome to another episode of the .NET Show. In this episode, we're going to talk about SQL Server 2005, or in its previous incarnation, you might have known it as the code name Yukon. But before we get into that, let's check in with Erica and the news.
Hello and welcome to the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers. On January 10th, Microsoft announced Microsoft Solution for Hosted Messaging and Collaboration 3.0, a next-generation hosted service that addresses the requirements of small and medium-sized businesses. The new offering, which is made available through Microsoft Service Provider and hosting partners, builds on the strengths of Microsoft Solution for Hosted Exchange 2003 by adding support for hosted versions of Microsoft Office Live Communication Server 2005 and Windows SharePoint services. This new solution enables service providers to deliver enterprise benefits such as enterprise-class email, shared calendaring, and instant messaging capabilities to small and medium-sized businesses. On January 19th, Microsoft announced the 2005 class of Microsoft's most valuable professionals. This select group of outstanding members from online and offline communities represents the richest, most technically and globally diverse community in the program's history, with more than 2,600 MVPs. Since October, Microsoft has awarded 173 first-time MVPs, 8 of whom represent countries that are new to the program. Currently, the Microsoft MVP program now represents individuals from 81 countries and 32 languages. Microsoft also announced this year's MVP Global Summit will take place September 28th through October 1st in Redmond, Washington. On January 27th, at the Florida Education Technology Conference, Microsoft announced Microsoft Class Server 4.0, the newest release of the company's premier learning management platform for grades K through 12. By helping teachers create, deliver, and grade standards-aligned assessments and lessons over the web, Class Server allows K through 12 school districts and their teachers to easily track, analyze, and improve student achievement against local curriculum standards in accordance with requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Class Server 4.0 allows teachers and students to access all their learning tools through a single sign-on learning gateway portal solution, a technology framework that delivers information from multiple systems through the same user interface. In early February, MSDN launched a new developer center dedicated to MSDN events and webcasts. The new site provides one place to learn about all upcoming developer-related events, either in person or online. The site not only highlights important upcoming national events, but also features blogs and comprehensive listings of all local events and live webcasts. Check out the new site at msdn.microsoft.com/events. And this has been the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers.
Welcome back. Now, today we're going to talk about SQL Server 2005 and how this new version of SQL Server can assist you in making better applications in your environment. A lot of people out there probably haven't been focusing on writing SQL Server or database applications, but I think now we've finally got some capabilities that can allow you to make that much better use of something like this in your applications, whatever they might be. To talk about SQL Server 2005 and what these capabilities might happen, we have James Hamilton and Tom Rizzo. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So James, what can you tell me about what's important about SQL Server 2005? Imagine that I really hadn't been thinking about databases for a long time. Why should I suddenly start thinking about it just because of this new version?
I think you should always think about databases, but it's a particularly good time now. SQL Server 2005 is a major release for us. It's one where we're taking a leadership role in making databases easy to use from a developer perspective. We've for years led in ease of use. No one produces an easier to install, lower cost of administration database than SQL Server. And we're kind of proud the entire industry is kind of coming along and starting to focus on those same things. SQL Server 2005, we're focused on the second major problem faced by enterprises today, and that's the cost of development. So that's number one. That's the big focus.
So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for developers to use with it. And so previous to this, I mean, development would have been more difficult. in SQL Server and in other databases?
Yeah, I understand your question. This is for a database guy, it almost goes without saying. Databases aren't easy to write software against. The interface between between SQL and the programming language itself has been a little bit of a cumbersome boundary. If you wanted to write server-side code, and almost every real app includes some server-side code, then you have to write in a different language. You have to write in T-SQL. Or if you're writing it using Oracle, it's PL SQL, but it's the same thing. It's a completely different realm. It's a completely different language. The development tools, industry-wide, are fairly weak. SQL Server 2005 is about fixing that. It's a fundamental step forward. You can now write stored procedures, user-defined functions, triggers in managed code. So you're no longer forced to use T-SQL. T-SQL is absolutely still supported, works as well as ever. But you can write in any language now. And for some customers that have huge applications or huge percentages of their application are running server-side, makes a big difference. In addition to that, we've got great tools available for T-SQL and for managed code. In other words, for the debugger, for example, supported, which sounds like a breakthrough from the 1970s, but databases haven't had that quality of support in the past. SQL Server 2005 changes that.
Now, previously to having the CLR actually built into SQL Server,
Yeah.
I mean, we had ADO.NET.
Yep.
How is that different? Why isn't ADO.NET the same thing as using CLR inside of SQL?
It is the same thing by some measures. ADO.NET is a managed development environment. It's the way you get at a database from within managed code. The thing that's different is ADO is pardon me, not ADO, but managed code's been a wonderful development environment for the mid-tier, great development environment for client-side tier, but in the database, you had to write in T-SQL.
So ADO kind of had a doorstep that it couldn't cross over once it hit the SQL Server line?
Yeah, ADO is the way you get from managed code to the database. The problem is managed code hasn't run on the database before. So now we've moved managed code to the database, and in doing that, the interface that you use from within the server to get access to data is ADO.NET. Mm-hmm. So what you're seeing is the same symmetric programming environment is available on the server, the mid-tier, and client tiers, and the same tools are available. Mm-hmm. And I like to emphasize debuggers just because that's the one that I like best. It's super useful having that on the data tier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing I'll add that SQL Server 2005 provides is we heard a lot from customers and from developers that XML is really important, that they have relational data, they've got XML data, and those two worlds never crossed. In 2000, we could take XML data and shred it into the database, but we would turn it into relational data. And what a lot of developers said was, I want my XML data, but I want to store it in the database, but I want all the functionality that XML provides. So things like XPath and XQuery, one of these newer standards to query XML data, I don't want to have to be forced to shred that data into the database so that I get to store it in the same format and I get it back in the same format. So that's very, very consistent between the XML that I store in my mid-tier and the XML I store inside of the database. Mm-hmm. Beyond the XML support, we also added in web services. In 2000, we had SQL XML, which a lot of developers used, but it required a mid-tier IIS server in order to be able to do web services from the database. What we heard from developers was they wanted web services directly out of the database and not be required. They could use, but not be required to use IIS to manage that on the server side. And the great thing about web services directly from the database is we can interoperate with many, many more development environments or even runtime environments. So you can use third-party tools to create queries against the database or call stored procedures, and that will be just a SOAP call to the database, and we'll return back the information through a SOAP call. So we've kind of taken the world of XML, relational, even semi-structured sorts of data and tried to combine them inside of SQL Server 2005 to help the developer build against all their different types of data.
So you're saying with web services, we can actually, pattern a web service call from within the database itself, correct, rather than taking and having to write some ADO.NET code that wrapped a database call and return that back again.
I mean, eventually we'll turn it into a database call under the covers for you, but what we do is you just create what we call an endpoint, an HTTP endpoint. We listen on a port. You tell us what port, what security you use. It just uses web-based standards like WS security. We can authenticate against the web services standards. And you make a SOAP call. You tell us what you want, whether to call a stored procedure, or call a T-SQL batch, as we call it. So that could be a select star from data, my table inside of my database. And then we'll put that into a SOAP message and send it back to you, and it just looks like a web service call, whether it's coming from a database or from some component that you wrote. You don't really know it's SQL Server in the back end there.
There's 2 points that are important to bring up there. One is security.
Yep.
You have complete control, and by default, nothing's open. So you decide, I want to open up just this stored procedure, or I want to grant just these users access. So you get complete control from a security perspective.
Yep.
Second thing is the advantage that gives you is once you decide you want to open up some stored procedures, you can now get access to it from, you said, from all different types of tools. The one that gets me is from a Unix environment or from any mid-tier, whether any of our clients run there or not, it's supported.
Yep. I mean, we're testing against all different clients. Obviously our premier client is the Visual Studio.NET environment and its web services support in the Microsoft runtime, but there are customers out there who need to build in a Java environment on non-Microsoft platforms, and that's one of the key reasons why we did web services.
Now, how tightly do you tie into the Visual Studio development environment?
We are shipping with Visual Studio 2005, so we are completely tied in with the Visual Studio environment. You can build, as James said, stored procedures, user-defined functions, user-defined aggregates, all using the CLR technology running inside of the SQL Server database. But beyond that, for the developers who are going to still build mid-tier applications, we've enhanced Visual Studio to be a much, much richer data development environment. And you'll see enhanced grid controls for SQL Server. You'll see enhanced debugging across the mid-tier and the server side for SQL Server. You'll see just enhancements throughout the product for productivity for the developer inside of Visual Studio.
And all this is really tying into the whole .NET framework and what Visual Studio applies that way with web services, including the CLR. So it kind of raises this question, how does .NET affect SQL Server? Both from the developer standpoint, as a developer on SQL Server,
Yep.
What do you think about .NET, and how do you think it affects it of developers trying to access the database? Is .NET improving their experience there, or is it just simply another flavor?
We believe that managed code's the future, and it's just a phenomenally more productive environment. My first experience probably goes back almost 8 years now, and I'm a systems guy. Everything I've written in the past before that had always been native code. I was amazed by how productive the environment is, just by how much more quickly an application can be put together. We believe in it, and we believe the real asset is merging that wonderful development environment with the database, because almost any application of any interest at all has persistent state. And so making sure that persistent state management, database calls, database support is a native part of the language and is absolutely as well supported as any other component. That's the goal, and we're very, very close to that with SQL 2005 and the would-be combination.
Yeah, and you talk about Visual Studio integration. Visual Studio is very good for developing SQL stuff, but we even use inside of SQL Server the Visual Studio shell for our management tools, because a lot of DBAs, they're not full developers, but they still have to write T-SQL code and they still need a rich environment. We built our management tools on top of the Visual Studio shell. So that's just how tight our integration is. We completely rewrote our management tools in C#, and we got tons of productivity from being able to do that. It used to be written in C++. And it's just a testament to the power of .NET, just in terms of internal Microsoft productivity. And we hope that our enhancements with SQL will make that productivity go out to our customers, whether they're writing database triggers, stored procedures, user-defined functions in a .NET language.
Now, James, being an 8-year veteran of SQL Server, when you first heard about managed code, were you sold on it immediately?
In my case, I think I was converted a little bit earlier, where I'd done some managed code work at a previous company. I've pretty much completely bought in when I joined the SQL team, and in fact, it was in my development team that we got started with .NET. In fact, way before we shipped SQL 2000, we actually had development work underway, and we were nurturing this small team along, trying to keep resources on it so that we could be there and be ready for SQL Server 2005 announce. So yeah, I was pretty big on managed code from day one, and if anything, become more sold on it as time's progressed. It's just a more productive environment, simple as that.
The big question will be, how fast do developers pick it up, right? We're big believers in it, right? And we saw the productivity gains, but a lot of customers, when they're building applications, or ISVs, when they're building packaged apps, they say, when do I use the CLR? And when do I use T-SQL? right?
And what do you tell them?
And we tell them if it's a majority of your application is just data access, just sending up select statements, inserts, updates to the database, T-SQL is a bare bones data access language, and we've optimized it for that. If you need very complex mathematical functions, string functions, things that T-SQL is not very good at, procedural logic. I mean, T-SQL is not a very good procedural logic sort of programming environment. Then you're going to want to use the SQL CLR. Now, there is a gray area where you could say, I'm a VB person, I'm a C# person, I have those skills. I'm not 100% skilled in T-SQL, but I want that productivity of the knowledge I already have. Well, you could use SQL CLR in those scenarios, and you're paying a little bit of price, possibly in performance of the application, but you are getting more productivity out of actually building that application using the CLR technologies in SQL Server.
Okay, so in those pure data setup sort of concepts, the CLR isn't quite as performant as
You're going to
T-SQL.
pay a little bit of overhead, right? I mean, it is a layer on top of. T-SQL is kind of, you can think of T-SQL as the stripped down kind of fast car, right? If you want to do data access. It doesn't have the nice leather seats. It doesn't have, all the nice additions to the car.
The cup holders.
The cup holders, of course, for the Starbucks. But it will get you there pretty fast, right? It doesn't do it in a pretty way, right? But it will get you there. Now, on the other hand, if you want to kind of write more complex things, you need a more complex sort of environment to build your applications. The SQL CLR is going to be a much better environment for building more complex sorts of applications. The easiest thing for developers, if you're writing extended stored procedures today in C++ and SQL Server, those are a prime candidate to move to the SQL CLR technologies. Provide you better performance, possibly better performance, but it will provide you better security, better debugging environment, just better integration with the server itself.
Yeah, it's not even, XPs are beyond a candidate. XP should be rewritten, period.
Totally.
It's just running native code inside the SQL Server address space. It's high risk. The performance of calling from an XP into the server is not wonderful. So move to SQL CLR is the right thing to do, period. We should be, make sure we emphasize that all of this work we're spending, all this time we've spent on making server-side development super easy is not an effort to encourage people to write more server-side code. The decision process is identical to what it's ever been, and that is, if you can run code efficiently outside the server, it probably belongs in the mid-tier. But there exists some operations where it's much more efficient to run the operation close to the data than it is to pull all the data over to the mid-tier. So that's always been true, still true today. So that's one reason why you might want to run code in the server, and lots of customers are doing that. There's security reasons why having a higher level of abstraction in the server makes sense. So instead of providing access to base tables, you provide stored procedures or views and provide access to those and lock down the base tables. So that's another reason why you might want to write server-side code. Enforce a business logic, another reason why you want to be absolutely positive that every address that gets put in is checked for normalization. Well, again, server-side code is the right way to do that. So those are the reasons why you want to write server-side code. Those haven't changed. What we're doing is we're saying we understand that people have to, and when they do have to, SQL Server should be the most productive environment to write that server-side code in.
Yeah, and the other point on the CLR is we integrated it into SQL Server so we could innovate ourselves, right? I mean, we're taking advantage of it in different aspects of SQL Server. I mean, for us to provide user-defined types, it's a new feature of 2005 where a developer can come in and say, you know what, SQL Server, I don't like, your varchar or money or float or whatever types we've implemented in the server. I want to build my own because I know it better or you don't provide it. They can fire up and create their own user-defined type. It will look like a native type to SQL Server, but it's leveraging the CLR technologies. And in future versions of SQL Server, we may leverage that same technology to add new types to the server very, very quickly. So it's a benefit not only for our customers, but for the SQL Server team itself in terms of innovations.
I'd go further. It's as well as a benefit to those two, it's a benefit to a third group, and that's ISVs.
Yes.
Building 35, that's where SQL Server is developed. We don't know every domain that customers are working in. We're never going to, I gave address normalization as an example. It turns out address normalization is a reasonably complicated problem. Doing a good job of it requires some skill. We don't have it. And it's not likely to become part of SQL Server in the next few releases. It's just not likely to happen. It's an opportunity for an ISV to say, they can use our SQL CLR support to build address normalization natively into SQL Server. It looks like it was just a part of the standard SQL distribution, and that's a triple win. It means an ISV has a whole new market they didn't have before. Customers are happy because they got address normalization part of their database, which normally it wouldn't have happened. And we're happy because our customers have a richer product and they're happier with it. So,
Yeah,
in fact,
win
all
all
three.
around. Yep.
So where do you see SQL Server as evolving from a platform position? Do you see databases becoming more important in a platform? Like myself, I'm really not a database guy. I don't use databases that often, and when I do, it's just kind of a SharePoint database, and I kind of make a couple calls to it here and there with
Yeah,
video.
we'll work on you.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get you there. We'll get you yet.
We'll give you the database religion. Right? You'll be storing everything in a database when we're done with you.
Our vision is to continue the trend that's been going on for 30 years, and that is relational databases and SQL Server should be the store that's used for all structured data. But we see way beyond that. Only about 5% of the world's data is structured. We want to give customers the same advantages that they've had with structured data for unstructured data. We want to allow any data, whether it be fully structured or even completely down to unstructured text, to be stored efficiently in the database. We want them to profit from all the utilities that come from a database, including backup and restore and some of the data integrity facilities and the fact that it can be updated and supports multi-user access in an efficient way. So our vision is help our customers manage the other 95% of their data. And SharePoint's a beautiful example of that. SharePoint's a wonderful environment, and it's built on SQL Server. And it's an example of us making a step in that direction. The XML support that Tom referred to earlier, it's another step in that direction where we see a huge amount of the world's data is going to be stored in XML. Office team is moving strongly towards XML. If we're correct that the vast majority of the less structured data is going to be in XML form, then the work that we've done in SQL 2005 is going to be super valuable to customers, to be able to query into that, to be able to enforce schemas where they want schemas enforced. That's, I think, part of our vision of helping customers manage the other 95% of their data.
Yeah, one of the big enhancements that we did as well was around full text search, because a lot of customers store blobs, just binary data, whether it's a Word document or Excel or just some binary data in the database. And one of the things that prevented the database from being a very rich environment was being able to search those blobs in a performant, richer way. And so a lot of people go back to the file system and just store stuff in the file system or in SharePoint or in other places. And so the full text search work that we did to take full text search, make it very scalable, very performant, add new functionality like the source lookups and those sorts of things, I think will help customers become database people if they're not today, right? And as James said, the XML support we think will help bring more semi-structured data into the database. And then I personally believe the XQuery support. If you get XML data into the database, you need a rich way to query it. The XQuery standard that is coming out and that we've implemented a certain version of it inside of SQL Server 2005 will help make XML more mainstream in customers.
So what exactly is XQuery?
You can I think of XQuery, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I think of XQuery is to XML data like T-SQL is to relational data, in that you can store an XML document. That document could be very large, and you may want to write a query that says, show me all my customers in a particular state. But all the customer information is stored in XML documents in multiple rows inside of a database. XQuery can reach into an XML document and actually query like you can query relational data. And one of the interesting things that we've architected in SQL Server is this idea of cross-domain queries, where you can have a relational query and an XQuery together in the same statement. So I could say, show me all my customers where their state is Arkansas, and that's stored in XML, and they've bought more than $1,000 from me, and that's stored as relational data. And we'll combine that all together and return back to you a single view of the data that should be returned.
And that's because SQL Server understands the XML structure inherently, and therefore is able to walk into the XML and just apply that XQuery to it.
Apply that XQuery to it. We made sure XML was just another kind of type of data that our query execution pipeline, our parser, kind of understands and knows how to run queries against.
Right. So a column can be declared of type XML, and an index can be created over an XML column. And other than that, it's symmetric support.
Now, with XML becoming so important, won't it eventually replace the native SQL database model?
There are some people that have believed that, and there have been, well, there's probably been 10 or 15, maybe even 20 startups that have told us that's what's going to happen. Most of those startups are now working on information integration or some other problem not quite related to native XML store. I think my view of the future, and I think the one that's viewed broadly across the entire SQL team, is relational databases really are a great place to store structured data. It's the right answer. What we want to do is use XML to help extend relational databases to store less structured data. But we're never going to recommend to customers take beautiful, well-normalized personnel and finance records and store them in XML. It's not going to run as well. It's not going to be as maintainable. So this is about helping customers manage new types of data. It's not about changing the format of existing data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if a developer came to me and said, I'm going to convert all my customers to XML, right, I'd be from relational database. Yeah, I'd be a little nervous. Yeah. I love the early adoption of the XML technologies that you're suggesting, but it's probably not the best idea in the end, right? Most developers will probably use a mixture of both.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like the right tool for the right job.
Correct. Yeah.
So, again, back to the platform aspect of things. Is SQL Server trying to become more of a broader tool that more application vendors can rely on the same way they rely upon other features of the platform?
I would say yes. I would say every release of SQL Server, we want to provide more to the application developer, right? And you've seen us progress down this path, right? And I mean, you can go ADO to ADO.NET, right? SQL 2000 to SQL 2005 with CLR and XML. And one part that we really haven't talked about for the developer is business intelligence even, right? And one of the things that we're doing in the business intelligence space in 2005 is today BI, the way to get broad adoption with business intelligence is through developers. By embedding it inside of their applications, things like data mining built into an application or reporting built into an application. That's the way you drive mass adoption of BI. It's not, us building just a platform and then no one taking advantage of it. And we've had good success in the BI space. But one key thing we're doing for developers in 2005 is, reporting services released it about a year ago in January 2004, and over 130,000 people have downloaded it, and it's been very popular. And the next step for us was to take our report controls, as we call them, that other developers can't host, and make them hostable and embeddable in other applications. And that's what we've done with Visual Studio 2005. A developer can go in, create a Windows-based application or a web-based application, drop in a report control, that's reporting services, and render a report right in their app with charting and drill down and all the rich reporting capabilities. But we do not require the report server of SQL Server. And it's really making reporting embeddable. Mm-hmm. Now, if you want subscriptions and scalability and multiple output formats beyond HTML, going out to PDF or other things, you'll want to buy that reporting server in SQL Server. But we wanted to drive reporting as a mainstream thing that every developer gets inside of Visual Studio 2005 with reporting services.
This is a core strategy that's going to continue release after release. We're after, as I said earlier, expanding the types of data that can be stored in SQL Server, but we're also after giving more value to customers that are storing data in SQL Server. And report server is a beautiful example of that. That used to be really expensive and it's only very high value data that you could afford to write reports against. Now it's just a standard part of SQL Server. Any data that's stored in SQL Server has report server support. So
yeah, a lot of developers would grow their own, right? They write an ASP.NET application that effectively was a report.
Yeah.
And a million customers doing that is a lot of code that is has to be maintained and kept up to date. So a report control we think will help tremendously with customers and their applications.
Now, for the last 10 years, we've been a very web-focused world, which I guess is good from a database standpoint because now suddenly connectivity is expected, and so that means we have servers that we're expected to be connected to, where in the past that wasn't quite the case, and websites are accessing the servers and doing reports or that sort of stuff. I'm noticing a move towards more the semi-connected apps now, whether it's Outlook works very well, whether it's connected to the Exchange server, whether it's disconnected.
Yep.
How does SQL Server play a role in allowing me to have a semi-connected access to a database?
This is Yeah, your referenced Outlook is perfect. When Outlook, in the previous release, put in support for HTTPS, so you could run disconnected mail and not have to VPN through the firewall. Wonderful support. I'm a huge fan of disconnected operation. What SQL Server is doing to make that easy, and what a lot of our customers are doing today, is we provided in the past MSDE. In the future, we're providing SQL Server Express, which is a lightweight version of SQL Server that's available without charge, and it's both affordable and deployable on the client side. We've removed some of the confusing limits that were available in MSDE that caused people to be concerned of whether the workload would be supported or not, made it crystal clear with SQL Server Express. And some of our major CRM customers are, for example, are deploying in this model. And so each customer or each one of their employees is actually running a small version of SQL Server on their desktop.
Yeah, I mean, as James said, MSDE's been very popular, both positively and negatively in some times,
I can
right?
point to both.
Yes, a lot of IT pros out there say, I didn't even know MSDE was on my user's desktop. Some app installed it, right? And that can lead to some issues later on down the road, as we've all lived through. But with Express, we've done away with the workload governor. There was this workload governor in MSDE, and it was always, trivia at a party. What is the workload governor for MSDE? Is it connections? Is it queries? No one would know, and it was this magical black
Witchcraft.
magic. Yeah, it was witchcraft, effectively. So ISVs wouldn't know where their app would scale. So we really limited it now in a deterministic way by CPU, memory, and database size. So a developer can come in and say, am I going to grow beyond these limitations? And if I am, I better go buy SQL Server. Otherwise, my application can run on Express. Mm-hmm. We make it embeddable inside of other apps, so you can redistribute it with your applications. One other technology that we've advanced as well is SQL Server CE, which is now called SQL Server Mobile Edition. So there's requirements by customers to run on a Pocket PC or a smartphone or even a tablet PC, a more mobile sort of environment than maybe a laptop or a desktop even that Express runs on. And we've enhanced Mobile Edition to support those sorts of scenarios. The big thing there is it now supports tablet PC. So not only does it run on the Pocket PC, but you can run it on the tablet PC. And it has the replication, kind of what you were talking about with Outlook and Exchange. SQL Server Mobile Edition supports that with SQL Server. So it can work over HTTPS. It can do what's called merge replication. So you can be offline, change something changes on the server. We'll do conflict handling, or the developer can write custom conflict handling. So it's a very rich environment for building these mobile sets of applications in a semi-connected environment.
So I can be relying on a big back-end SQL Server database someplace and pulling a cache down locally,
Exactly.
and all my queries are going through the cache. So if I'm offline, it doesn't matter to me.
It's seamless to you.
Couple technologies that help. One is big changes in replication. Replication is easier to deploy. Much more functionality has been added in this release. The second one that we're really excited about is SQL Server Broker. We now have a capability of running request brokers, so each disconnected client can connect up, download or pull from a queue. If whenever they become available, whenever they come online, they can pull from the queue. Whenever they're offline, they can continue to operate. And so SQL Server Brokers it's our support for asynchronous for writing code asynchronously. It's great for disconnected clients, but it's also the right model to build large applications that were previously built monolithic. Yeah. You can now break them up into independent components and run Broker between them.
Yeah, the Broker, as James said, it's asynchronous messaging in the database. I like to think about it, right?
Yep.
And no one should confuse it with MSMQ or Indigo or any of these other technologies. If you want to build a scale-out SQL Server-based application, Service Broker is probably what you're going to use. We optimized it for the SQL Server scenario. But if you're building just a generalized sort of message queuing application, it's MSMQ or Indigo would probably be the technologies you would use. But we want to make sure that a lot of customers have said in web scenarios they want the scale out sort of of their business logic in the database to scale out, and that's why we built Service Broker, this asynchronous messaging in the database itself.
So what's the time frame for SQL Server 2005?
I'll let James answer that question.
I think you can handle that one. We're very confident. It's named SQL Server 2005 because it's shipping in 2005, and it will be out this summer.
Yep.
And if I was a developer or an architect, I want to kind of learn more about how SQL Server 2005 might affect my business decisions and how to write applications, where are the best places for people to go to?
Yeah, there's a couple of places. Hopefully everyone's an MSDN subscriber. And if you are, you can download our community technical previews of SQL Server 2005. We released one back in December, and we'll keep releasing these every couple of months. We have, on the schedule, we have a couple more, before we release. And that's the best places to get the bits and give that a try. The other thing, too, is, with our Beta 2, it's not with our CTPs, but with our Beta 2, we have a resource kit, which includes webcasts, hands-on labs, sample applications, those sorts of things, so that you can get a better understanding at an architectural level and even at an implementation level what the right things to do with SQL Server 2005 and how to prepare for it. The final thing I'll point out is every developer should download the Best Practices Analyzer for SQL Server 2000. Not only will it scan their existing applications and say you're doing this incorrectly on your SQL Server in the applications you built, but it also includes somewhat of an upgrade advisor. So it will tell you what is going to go wrong if you try to upgrade your SQL Server and what's been deprecated. So we don't want developers writing to deprecated features inside of 2005, so every developer should run this Best Practices Analyzer. It's a free tool off of Microsoft.com/SQL, and they should definitely go get it.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us. I know, Tom, you're going to join me a little bit later on for some demos.
Yeah, we'll take a look at SQL CLR and web services.
Yeah. And thanks, James.
Well, thank you.
So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what is coming in SQL Server 2005 and why you might want to start taking a look at it and understanding how maybe a database isn't such a bad thing after all. After this short break, Tom will be back and we'll take a look at some demos to show you some real SQL Server code in action.
UConn? I can't wait for it to come out because based on what I know, the integration with Visual Studio IDE and SQL Server is exactly what I need to get me to create my database applications in a more tightly integrated fashion with UConn.
And to me, it's integrating all data into an ability to query everything and to retrieve everything and to integrate it all together. So everything in my future world is going to be a database element. And to the consumer again, I can get to anything by metadata, so I'm excited.
What is UConn? That's the one after Longhorn, I think. I hope I'm not wrong about that since I'm on tape. But
Welcome back. Well, Tom's been nice enough to join us back again now to show us some developer demos of what it means to actually be a developer inside of SQL Server. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, we'll take a look at some of the technologies that James and I spoke about in the last segment. SQL CLR, how you get started using it, how to debug it, those sorts of things. We'll also talk about web services right from the database, when you would use them, and we'll show you all of that. Some things that we're not going to show you, but you should definitely take a look at is the XML support. And we'll talk a little bit further about that when I talk about web services. But XML is a key technology, obviously, across the industry. And we see that taking off.
Whether it's databases or not. I mean,
databases, even our people are storing configuration files. I remember the old, ini files, ini files. It's XML is just a format for the new ini sometimes inside the system. And we're guilty of that inside of SQL Server. We actually use XML configuration files for certain things. Some other things, too, that I just wanted to highlight before I start showing you some code and we start hacking away on the computer is there is this new technology that developers should look at in SQL Server 2005 called query notifications. ASP.NET 2.0 takes advantage of it. For those of you who've ever used ASP.NET, you know that it has the ability to cache information from a database, and you can invalidate that cache. Well, that was based on time previously. So it would wake up, and every 10 seconds, it would go to the database and say, have you changed, have you changed, have you changed? And that was a waste of mid-tier resources and waste of database resources. So with query notifications, it's a callback. You write your query that in the database that you want to send to the database. You send it up. You tell us what to call you back on, where to call you back to. And when data changes, we call you back. So, and then you can invalidate your cache and keep it around. So it will allow you to scale better, and it will allow for a much cleaner sort of application. And ASP.NET 2.0 includes it natively inside of its implementation, our query notifications technology. But developers can use it inside of Windows-based applications or other web-based applications possibly if they want to.
So you're basically telling the database, this is the database form I'm interested in.
Yes, this is the query I'm interested in. Select all customers from a certain area. And when we add a new customer that meets your criteria, we'll call you back and say, here is the new customer, invalidate your cache, effectively, is what we do. And it uses some of the technology that James talked about called that service broker, that asynchronous messaging. All we do is we create a queue, that has all of your information. And when that changes, when new information comes in, we fire into that queue calls out to you, and then you can do whatever you want with that data. There's some other enhancements too for the developer. ADO.NET obviously has been enhanced, and there's a whole bunch of things in ADO.NET, too much to actually cover here, but for those developers who use ADO.NET, and it's the majority of people, you'll see a ton of enhancements there. And then the final thing is for the kind of XML developer beyond the XML support in the database is in Visual Studio, we've added in a much richer XML editor than what we had in 2003. And we've also added in XSLT debugging. So if you've ever written an XSLT transform, you probably pulled out your hair when you wrote something wrong because there was no debugging. And you went in and you changed something and it didn't work. And you changed something and it didn't work. And you didn't know why. Well, now there's a full debugger for XSLT, right? So that's not really a database thing, but you may be taking XML data from the database and transforming it with XSLT. So it's an important technology. But enough of our jibber jabber here. Let's actually go and take a look at some of the technology. The first thing that you're seeing here is the December CTP, or our Community Technical Preview of SQL Server 2005. So any MSDN subscriber can go and download that. This is what's called Management Studio. So for the developer, you'll maybe use this occasionally, but it's more for the DBA, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But we're going to run some scripts out of it, and we're going to write some code in Visual Studio. But the one key thing about this is written on top of the Visual Studio shell. So this is the SQL Server team taking advantage of some of the Visual Studio goodness that comes in the Visual Studio shell. So you'll see things like color coding inside of here. When you're writing T-SQL code, we get all that value from building on top of Visual Studio. So let's go and write a SQL CLR store procedure. Now, the first thing here is I've got my databases. If I can find my mouse, there it is. One thing about Management Studio, too, that the developer should know is you can manage all of your different SQL Server services directly from one environment. So there's SQL Server, there's analysis services, there's reporting services. For the mobile developer, there's SQL Server Mobile Edition. So I can go and query my mobile database right from Management Studio, query it, create new tables, create new columns in my tables, do whatever I need to do to administer that database, even deploy it to the device. So there's a lot of benefits from the Management Studio environment. Now let's just fire up Visual Studio. Now one thing that developers need to know is make sure you run the right version of Visual Studio that corresponds to SQL Server. Because both products ship the .NET, the CLR, there are conflicts. Visual Studio might ship a later version of the CLR than SQL Server. So you're going to want to make sure you have matched builds.
During this beta time.
During the beta timeframe. When we ship, we'll ship at the same time, so you won't have this problem. And moving forward with versioning, we'll fix that so you can mix and match at a later point. But right now, you have to keep them in the same matching.
So if someone is already on the Visual Studio beta and they want to download the SQL Server version, how do they find the right Visual Studio for them? Yeah,
we tell you up on the website, so that's one good thing. We tell you what the right version to use is. And if you've already installed Visual Studio, unfortunately, you'll have to uninstall the .NET framework and install the SQL Server version of that. Now, if you've got a clean machine, what you'll want to do is you'll want to install SQL Server first and then Visual Studio during the beta process.
Okay.
So that's just something developers need to be aware of. Now, I'm not going to do justice to Visual Studio. Obviously, you'll probably have other speakers who will talk all about all the benefits of Visual Studio. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new project inside of Visual Studio. Now, I know a lot of developers are C# or VB developers, so we're going to love you both. We're going to create a stored procedure using the CLR using C#, and then we're going to take advantage of that from a VB application. So you get the...
That seems fair.
The J# and the C++ people feel a little left out, but that's okay. They can. So here we're going to go to C#, and you'll see that there's this new project type inside of Visual Studio. You're probably used to this other project type and then database under there. Well, that's, just a standard database project in Visual Studio 2003. There's nothing new there. What you want is under the language, we have this new database project, and you can see there's a SQL Server project here. So let's just name our project something. I'll call it the .NET Show project.
How original.
Yes. They don't pay me for originality. They just pay me for getting it right when I'm writing the code. So, okay, so here we go. It's going to start up here in a couple seconds, and this new project is the tight integration between Visual Studio 2005 and SQL Server 2005, and this will take advantage of the SQL CLR technology. It asked me for my database connection. We're going to use the infamous Northwind that everyone knows and loves.
I assume we've heard about that once before.
Yeah, exactly. It's shipped somewhere. I don't know where. And then you'll see over here, here's our standard solution that we're all probably used to, and I'm just going to come in and I'm going to add something to this solution. And I'm just going to add a new item. And in my new item, oops, let me cancel out of there. And let me go to actually not to the solution, let's go to the project here. And you can see down here, I can add in a user-defined function, a stored procedure, an aggregate, a trigger, or a user-defined type. Those are all SQL Server things.
Because it knows this is a SQL Server project, and so it knows it has SQL Server things it can do.
Exactly. And so we have templates. I'm going to come in here and say I want to create a stored procedure. I don't know what I'll call the stored procedure. I'll call it the .NET Show Sprock. Exciting names here today. And you see that it lays out a little bit of a template for me, right? It gives me this new system.data.SQL Server. Now, Robert, when is the show actually going to go out?
Probably about a month from now, we're right at the beginning of February, so probably beginning to mid-March.
Okay, so we're going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek here. Some of the things will change that I'm showing you, but let me just step you through what's going to change. First thing is this system.data.SQL Server. Most developers are are used to system.data.SQL Client. And that is the ADO.NET provider, the managed provider for SQL Server. Now, when you're running on the SQL Server, like you are when you're running a stored procedure using the CLR on the server, we don't really need to go out the network stack. We don't need to do any of that sort of stuff because you're running in the process of the server. And so that's why we built this system.data.SQL Server in-memory provider. So this is an in-memory provider. It talks to SQL Server through shared memory, so it's more performant. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the big feedback pieces that we heard from customers was, well, then I have to change my code if I want to run it on the server. I have to make it go from system.data.SQL Client to system.data.SQL Server. So it's a different provider. So the sneak peek we're giving you here is that this provider goes away. We actually integrate into the SQL Client provider the in-memory capabilities. And it's just on the connection string, you tell us whether you're running in the server or in the mid-tier. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to really change much code. It's just a connection string change for you, and there'll be a little bit of semantic changes that you'll see. So don't get attached to the SQL Server in-memory provider that you see here, right? So it'll be going away. So first thing we want to do is we want to just create a little string that we're going to pass along here, which is our customer ID. And, we're going to start writing some code inside of here. So here we have something called SQL pipe. So this is the pipe between the in-memory provider and the actual SQL Server itself. And we have this idea of SQL context. We know you're running in the server context. So we inherit things like security. Mm-hmm. We know your security context. We know all of that information, so you don't have to recreate that. And we'll just do a little get pipe call here. And then the next thing we're going to do here is we're just going to do a system.data. Now, I don't have to type all of this out, but I'm just going to make it look all nice and pretty for you. And we'll put in a SQL command. And we're just going to say SQL context dot, and we're just going to get our command object from inside of there. Oops, and I forgot my I'm already typing VB inside of here. And then we'll just pass our command text, right? And this is just standard stuff that any ADO developer knows what to do here. So I'm just going to put in my T-SQL. Now, a lot of customers, they think SQL CLR is managed T-SQL. So you can just fire up in C# and start writing some T-SQL code, or they think T-SQL goes away. Now, you can see clearly here, I still have to write T-SQL even in the SQL CLR, right? The way you get your data and send your queries to SQL Server is still through T-SQL. Mm-hmm. So people shouldn't say, I can forget all my SQL Server knowledge. You do still have to remember T-SQL, but you can wrap it with all the standard ADO.NET semantics that you're used to.
Right.
and then we'll say where customer ID equals at customer. Did my equals go at customer ID? Just a little parameter here. Okay.
Now, before you go too far, I think I better get you to fix a little bug you got here.
Where did I
The
do?
comma. SQL Server comma. Up on line.
SQL Server.
on line.
Oh, comma. Okay, that
There
was
you
supposed
go.
to be a dot.
Yeah.
I have my little code police sitting next to me here, so that's good. And then we'll just do a parameters. We need to pass our parameter, so we'll add a parameter in here, and we'll say at customer ID, and we'll actually do SQL DB type, and we'll make this nvarchar. Okay, and then we just need to pass this parameter here. So we'll say parameter 0 dot value equals the customer ID that you're going to pass to me. And then all I do is I do a SQL data reader, and I just make up my data reader here, and I say command dot execute reader. And then the last part I need to do is I need to say what I want to send back, right, from my stored procedure. So here I'll just grab my pipe, and I'll say send, and you'll see send. I can send a reader, I can send a record, I can send an error if there was a problem with it. Or I can just send some string message like, you know, your stored procedure completed if it doesn't really return anything. So what I'll do here is, since I already have my reader inside of here, I'll just send that back. And there you go. Very simple SQL CLR stored procedure. Now you may say, okay, Tom, you got this. How do you actually deploy it to the server? Well,
So,
again,
Tom, how do you deploy this to the server?
okay, that was okay. I was asking myself, but you asked me anyway. How do you deploy it to the server? Well, since it's built into Visual Studio, just deploy our solution. So if I typed it correctly all here, 0 errors or warnings, it's going to go and deploy the file. Now, a lot of DBAs who possibly watch the .NET show are freaking out right now, saying, my God, my developers are going to deploy all these crazy CLR stored procedures out to my server without me managing them. Well, no, that's not the case. I have permissions on the server. It's secure. You can't deploy it unless you have permissions to do that. So developers, you better go buy your friendly DBAs a nice gift, so they let you deploy their SQL CLR, let you deploy that out to the server.
So essentially what you've done, you've taken this, what is a stored procedure, which you normally don't write in Visual Studio like this.
Yep.
And that stored procedure has now been
Compiled.
compiled and embedded into the
Yep.
database.
Let's go take a look. So let's go back to our Management Studio inside of here. And let's go to our databases. And you'll see, here's my Northwind database. If I expand it, you'll see my stored procedures. I have to refresh this. You'll see inside of here now, .NET show Sprock is inside of there. So it's right inside of there. And then you see we have this new tree inside of here, new folder called assemblies. So you see if I refresh this, there's the .NET show assembly sent up to the server. So we actually compile it, send it up to the server, and then there's some T-SQL commands to register the assembly and that sort of stuff. Visual Studio does that for you automatically. Now you can do it all manually, it's up to you, but Visual Studio is a great environment to actually deploy this to the server. Now, let's just give this a try. Let's go create a new query. And our query, we're going to connect to our SQL Server. We'll say use Northwind, go, and then we'll say execute. And now what do we call it? .NET show Sprock, Alfiki, our favorite customer. And let's give this a try. So there we go. And now if we execute that, we see returns back the customer ID and the contact name that we want. Now, the next step is, this is a simple stored procedure that we've written here. You may write something very, very complex and you need to debug it, right? Here, we don't have that much to debug, but one thing that we've done is we've made it very, very easy to debug directly from Visual Studio stored procedures or user-defined functions written using SQL CLR. So I'm just going to enter in a breakpoint here. There's one more change that we need to make. If you come to your test scripts over here, you'll see this test.sql. This is the script that will run when the debugger starts to actually test out our stored procedure. So we expect a parameter. So let's add Alfiki inside of here as well. And then let's just debug it. So let's just start our debugger. And we should hit our breakpoint. Bam, there we go. And obviously, Visual Studio has this really nice feature, which is kind of an in-place object browser for debugging, so I could drill into my SQL pipe or my SQL context and get more information about that. But this gives you an idea of how you can easily debug. Now, the interesting thing is we can debug across languages. So if I come over into my call stack, you'll see I have T-SQL and C#. So it actually executes a T-SQL statement, which was that, execute my stored procedure, and it stepped me into a C#, my stored procedure itself. Now, if I had a VB stored procedure that the C# one called, or another T-SQL stored procedure that, that called, we could step across all these different languages. So it's seamless integrated debugging across languages. The other interesting thing that we can do is debug across tiers. So you may have a mid-tier component that you've written in ADO.NET that calls a SQL CLR stored procedure on the server. You want to debug that mid-tier component and then jump to the server and debug that SQL CLR stored procedure.
So you're actually going completely into this to the server-side
You can.
database.
There is a little bit of magic you need to do. You need to set a breakpoint in both places, but we can understand that jump and get all that context and do all of that good debugging across those tiers. So there's an extra step, but we want to make the debugging experience very, very seamless across all the different environments. And then I can just, step into or step over or do all the different debugging capabilities that I need to inside of my actual debugging session, right? Set up some, go to the immediate window, set up some watches, whatever it is, I can figure out what my problem is. So I'll just let this run to completion, and we've finished debugging. So the next thing that, a developer may want to do is they may want to say, you know what, I want to expose that SQL CLR stored procedure as a web service. But I don't want to have to set up IIS. I don't want to have to go through all the whole rigmarole. I just want a kind of a web services listener inside of SQL Server. And that's what we've built in our new HTTP endpoint support. It's not the most sexy marketing name that you've ever heard, but it really helps you to expose any SQL Server functionality as a web service. Now, one thing I want to point out is both SQL CLR and web services are off by default when you install SQL Server. So I don't want developers out there saying, oh my God, is this on by default? What if a virus comes along or anything like that? You do have to explicitly turn it on, both the CLR and the web services support. So we are making sure that it is very secure out of the box. One other interesting thing too is I'm showing you full SQL Server here, but this is our developer edition. But all of this technology for SQL CLR is supported in Express, the free version. So a developer can build against the free version and embed it inside their applications and get all these benefits. The final thing.
What is the developer difference in? So if I install SQL Server Express, do I get the same tools like this SQL Server Manager? Do I get this with SQL Server Express?
No, you don't get this tool, the Management Studio. I believe I have it on this machine. If I don't, I will talk to it. But we have something called SQL Server Express Manager. And I'm looking off your screen, and I don't believe I have it on here. There it is, Express Manager. So one of the big feedback we heard from MSDE was that it included no management tools. So customers were frustrated by that. Let me just put in my server here. And so one thing that we said we would do is we would build management tools for the Express edition. And this is what this Express Manager is. Now, you're not going to get the full functionality of Management Studio. It really is, allows you to come in and create databases, define those databases, the tables in those databases, the columns in those tables, and to query. So if you wanted to come in and write a quick, dirty T-SQL query, quick and fast, you can use Express Manager to do that. Now, going from nothing to something is a lot better than, nothing, right? So, we've gotten good feedback on this. It's currently in beta. You can download it off the web. So if you haven't already, take a look at Express Manager, give it a try, and definitely provide your feedback on it. We expect it to ship around the same time as SQL Server 2005.
Thanks.
And then the final thing before I get off the SQL CLR, my SQL CLR kick here, is let me just bring up the properties for this assembly. And I want to just touch on security a little bit in a little bit more detail. Now, for those of you who use extended store procedures, you should definitely migrate to the SQL CLR. With the SQL CLR, we have this idea of permission sets. And we have 3 permissions. We have safe, which is a sandbox mode. So you can only access SQL Server and the things that your user account that you're running under the context of has permissions in SQL Server. So you can't access, tables that you shouldn't have permissions on in that context. We have what's called external access, which is you can go onto the disk or you can go onto the network, right? In safe mode, you can't go to the network, you can't go to the disk, you can only go to SQL Server. And the final mode is unsafe. This is you can create COM objects, manage code, whatever you want. You can destroy the system if you really wanted to. We recommend safe, but if you really need to, you can run an unsafe mode, and that's why we named it that, to try and scare people away from it. But unsafe is effectively what extended store procedures run in today. And so that's why the SQL CLR is a prime place for people to migrate their extended store procedures to.
Because it's safer.
Because it's safer. We even support code access security inside of the SQL CLR, so you can lock down actual code blocks that we run based on permission sets. Okay, I think we've taken the SQL CLR horse and beaten it to death enough, so we'll leave it there. So we want to take our store procedure and expose it out as a web service, and you're going to have to help me remember the name of the store procedure when we get over there. .NET show Sprock. Okay, I should have named it A or something. It would have been a lot easier for me. But I've got a simple script that I've written here, so you wouldn't have to watch me type all of this. But we have this idea of endpoints, which I was talking about, HTTP endpoints, as well as TCP endpoints. We support this idea of any client connecting to the server has to connect to an endpoint. And that allows us better security. You can secure the endpoints. You can have different types of endpoints, different ports, different sorts of capabilities across these different endpoints. That's why we did it this way. Let me just make sure I dropped my endpoint from my test run. And you can see here's some code that says create endpoint, and I name it SQL endpoint, state, and this can be started, paused, disabled, whatever you want. We definitely want to use it. So I'm going to make it start as in a started mode. And then we have as, and then you put in the protocol. So I'm going to go over HTTP. This could be TCP, or it could be another protocol, like our database mirroring technologies. And then you just say what virtual site you want to use, the path, your virtual directory path, the authentication. And this is just use standards Windows-based, web-based authentication, integrated, digest, basic, anonymous. And then we support ports. So if you wanted to use SSL, if you wanted to use different ports than the default port, you could put your ports inside of here. This is just some definition for our endpoint for using web services. And then we have our payload, effectively, which is down here, which is for SOAP. We don't have sexy names. We're database guys, right? We don't, we like the bare metal, right? We're for SOAP endpoints. We don't call them XML web services or that sort of stuff. But we do have a shout out to our friends in .NET land with this web method, which this is the method you want to expose through your web service. So we'll call this get customer info, which is what it does. And then here we need to change our script a little bit, but this is what we're actually going to call inside of SQL Server. So there's my Northwind, my database owner, and then .NET show Sprock. There we go. And then we can also limit the format. So I'm just going to say don't return back error information or any of that sort of stuff, completion information. Just return back the data. That's what that format equals row sets only. And then you can have customized schema. So we support custom schema for your actual web services. We even support custom WSDLs. So if you wanted to generate your own WSDL, you can do that. I'm just going to use the default WSDL. And we are testing against a number of different products with the web services technology. We're testing against, obviously, Visual Studio in 2003 and 2005, but we're also testing against non-Microsoft products. So you'll see some open source products, JBuilder, if you're building in a Java environment. We test against those products to make sure our web services and WSDLs are interoperable in a non-Microsoft environment. Then batches. So this is just, can you send up T-SQL batches to the server? So just random T-SQL statements. Obviously, you want to turn this off by default so you don't get injection attacks or any sort of bad T-SQL statements coming up. But if you have a need for it, we support it. I turn it on just to show you that. And then what database I'm actually using. So enough talking about it. Let's actually run this little script here. And now we have an endpoint. Exciting, right? Command completed successfully. Let's go use that endpoint. Let's come back into Visual Studio. Let's create a new project. And this time, we're going to give a shout out to our VB friends. We're going to create a VB Windows application. It's not going to be the prettiest Windows application you've ever seen in your life, but it will show how we can use the technology. And there we go. And I just have to point out one very, very cool feature of Visual Studio, if you've ever created Windows-based applications, is the lineup tool. I don't know if you've seen it.
Love that.
But lining up text boxes with buttons, Visual Studio's 2005 is night and day.
Almost make anybody a designer.
Almost. Yeah, even I can come up with a good design. So I won't show you that here because we're just going to drop a very simple button on here, but that is one of the coolest features, I think, inside of Visual Studio 2005. So the next thing we need to do is we need to come in and add a web reference to our web service. So we'll just come in using standard Visual Studio, add web reference. We'll just do a local host, since my SQL Server is running on my local host. And then remember that /SQL I had as my directory.
Yep.
And then I'll just do !WSDL. And it will generate a WSDL. SQL Server itself will generate a WSDL and send it back to this web service request. We see our get customer info inside of here, returning back a SQL row set. We have a bug here. We don't tell you the type there, so we'll be fixing that. We found it as part of this demo, so thank you, Robert, for forcing us to find that. And then you see the SQL batch. So if I wanted to send up batch commands, I could do that as well. And I'll just add this reference, just like I add any standard web service reference. And then we need to write a little bit of code. So there we go. We've got our reference. We'll click behind our button, and we'll start writing some code here. So the first thing we need to do, is do localhost dot equals system.net credential cache default credentials. Uh-oh, we have a little bit of, did I misspell here? Ah, I know my problem. Excuse me for one moment. We need to stop. Oh, it stopped. We may have to re-record this one section here, Robert, if I can't figure this out. This is a good debugging session here. Okay, it already exists. We added it as a reference. This may hit the cutting room floor. Localhost. Ah, okay, reference map. No, create a reference.vb. We had a bug where it wouldn't create the reference.vb, so that actually worked. So let's see here. Yeah, it should be localhost.credentials.
Doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. Ah, because I'm a doof. You can fire me from the show after this, but we first need to, let's just dim it first. Every VB developer out there who's built web services was yelling that to me. We need to create a reference to our actual endpoint first. There we go. Now it should work. Now we have our credentials. The next thing we need to do is we need to create...
Good save, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to create a little bit of a data table reader here so we can get back our information and actually display it out as a message box. And let's do this. System.data.datatableReader. Yep, now we're going to use it. So we'll say ws dot. Now this is calling our web service, so we should see our get customer info. And then we can pass in Alfiki. I hope that's the way you say the name, or else I've been getting it wrong. And then we'll do the get data reader method on top of that to get our data reader. And then I'm just going to do str result as string equal to, and just initialize it. And now we're going to say while there's data, and hopefully this will only return back one row if I've done my query correctly. And we'll just say str result equals, from our data reader, let's get the first thing, convert it to a string, and then put a nice little space and get our second thing, convert that to a string, which should be the contact name. And then obviously everyone loves message boxes, so we'll say result, and then we'll say str result. All right, fat fingers save me now. Hopefully nothing's wrong there. We'll start without debugging here.
Start without debugging.
Yeah, we don't need to debug
No.
this. I got it completely right, I'm sure. And then let's click on our button. And there we go.
There you go.
So in 15 minutes, we created a SQL CLR stored procedure, we've debugged it, and we've created a web service from that stored procedure, and we've actually displayed it inside of a VB application.
So now, in this particular case, you're calling a web service that's on the local machine.
On the local machine.
But
Doesn't
that
have
web
to be.
service could have been on some server on the
Could have
internet,
been.
something like that.
This is my development box, so I have SQL Server obviously installed locally. But this could be sitting back in my data center, and I could call that web service across the internet even if I wanted to. Look it up in UDDI if it was published out to UDDI. This really shows you how you can expose your SQL Server functionality as a web service, and your end developer, if you develop the web service and all that stuff, your other developers don't have to know the tightly coupling of ADO.NET to that. They can just call it via web services interfaces. So it's good. We talk about it for interoperability a lot, but it's good also for inside of a company or when you're building just a standard application and you want to use web services as your interface, as the way to call your methods of your application or set properties. This technology is great to do that. It abstracts out that it's SQL Server on the back end.
I mean, likewise, you could even have an ASP.NET website that is using web services to call some other server in order to give responses back to a browser client somewhere else.
Exactly. I mean, this technology, the uses are unlimited, right? And you'll see us expand it over time. Now, if a developer was to come to me and say, I'm going to replace all my ADO.NET calls with web services calls for every app, I would say it depends, right? Web services are, there's a little bit of work we need to do there. They're not as strongly typed sometimes as what you get from ADO.NET, that sort of stuff. So there are trade-offs that you get between web services and using ADO.NET in its strongly typed language. But for a majority of customers, you can combine the two.
Well, it's like that best tool for the best job.
Best tool for the best job. Web services aren't a hammer and everything's a nail, right?
Yep.
Use it in the right scenarios.
So you've talked to a lot of developers out there that are working on the beta and stuff like that. What have they seemed the most excited about?
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement. Obviously, SQL CLR is a very exciting thing for developers. And again, right tool for the right job. Don't make it a hammer and everything's a nail. I would say one thing that we haven't talked about that is very exciting for the developer is, and we haven't shown it, is on the business intelligence side, right? There's a lot of enhancements for the BI developer inside of SQL Server 2005. And one of the key ones is obviously the report controls that we're shipping in Visual Studio 2005. We talked about it in the last segment, but a lot of customers have been clamoring for taking reporting services type functionality and putting it in their own apps. And today, it's a kludge. We can do URL parameters to reporting services, so you have to embed a web browser control inside of your app and use URL parameters to do it. But that doesn't work offline, and you can't control the formatting all that well. It works, but it doesn't work really. And so with the report controls, you can just come into VS. You'll see a report control just in your toolbox. Drag it on, and you just point us at the data you want us to render out for you in the report. Your report definition, effectively, that you've created in VS using the design tool, and suddenly you have a fully featured reporting environment. And guess what? You can export it. So if you have a Windows-based app and you have your report and you want to add a functionality to export it to Excel, you don't have to write a line of code. You just write one line of code, actually. You just tell the report control to export it to Excel, and suddenly it works.
And you're done. Wow.
And you're done. You want to create a chart? Built in. Right? You don't have to go off and write chart controls yourselves or possibly buy a third-party chart control, but you can use the reporting services controls that we have.
Now, for the audiences, do you see this as being more aimed towards the Visual Studio developer and getting them into SQL Server? Or what about existing SQL Server database developers? Are they also getting excited about this? I mean,
I think there's a little bit for everyone, actually. SQL Server's taken us a while to get out the door, right? It's been a couple of years since we released 2000. And one of the good things I think about SQL Server 2005, it's good and it's bad, is that we've added a lot for everyone, right? Whether you're a DBA, a developer, or business intelligence, information worker sort of person. And on the developer front, for the kind of the DBA who wants to become a developer, I think we've made it easier with our tight integration with Visual Studio and our developer productivity features, both in SQL as well as in the Visual Studio data development environment. I would argue the bar to move from kind of an ad hoc data developer to more of a professional data developer was pretty high in VS 2002 or 2003, and we think that we've lowered that bar. For the professional developer, I mean, your Swiss Army knife of technologies has just gotten much, much greater, right? SQL CLR, the XML support, the web services support, service broker, query notifications. I mean, I didn't even talk about, and a lot of people are excited about this, is T-SQL itself has been enhanced in 2005. I mean, every SQL Server developer is a T-SQL developer. Make no mistake about that. But one of the big things that every developer, struggled with T-SQL was exception handling. We didn't have structured exception handling inside of 2000. You would have to write your T-SQL code, check for an error. It was like old style VB, right? I wrote VB6 code, and I would write something, and I would say, if number, does not equal 0, then, do something, right?
Guerrilla programming.
Guerrilla programming, exactly. It was down and dirty, bare metal, whatever you want to call it. And so SQL Server people still live in that world today. But with 2005, we have, try-catch blocks. So you can do something, try it. If it fails, catch it, and, do a finally to, end the transaction or do whatever you need to do. So we've brought T-SQL up to modern sorts of programming language standards. I mean, the other key thing in T-SQL for the developer is a lot of developers work with hierarchical data that's stored in a database. So let me give you an example here. An org chart. You may have personnel data that you store in your database, and you may know, oh, I work for Bill Gates, and you work for Bill Gates, and eventually people may work under us, and you have to create this org chart. Well, in a relational database today, that is very hard to work with hierarchical data. Obviously, XML will make it very easy, but let's say you're not using XML. So what we added in 2005 was the idea of recursive queries. So you can send a query that calls itself. So you could say, show me Bill Gates and all of his direct reports and all their direct reports, and you just call yourself and recurse through that hierarchical tree. And that's built into 2005. So it's very, very seamless. It's very easy for you to build these recursive types of queries inside of that environment.
Where do you see the future of SQL Server going for developers?
Yeah, SQL Server, you can see the start in 2005 expanding the platform. So this is just the application services that we provide. So XML, web services, service broker, notification services has been improved for subscription notification sorts of applications. We're adding in platform level functionality that developers can take advantage of. The next step for us, I would argue, is to continue down that path, but also add in more kind of application components, I'll call them, which is things like report controls, data mining controls, kind of working with Visual Studio on making their data visualization even better than what they have today. So it makes it more productive for data to exist inside of an application. The other thing, too, I think we're moving towards for developers is converging the world of data. Whether it's at the API layer or whether it's at the database layer, I think you'll see us continue down that path. And we worked on some object relational technology, object spaces. That work continues. It may not be in the same form that people from the PDC learned about it, but we still are investing in that object relational mapping technology, as well as supporting in the database more richer sorts of types in the database itself, as well as making the API work seamlessly across all these different types of data as well.
With the whole idea of just trying to make it easier for the programmer to integrate his needs into what the data is providing, and getting access to it.
As requirements come about for the developer, let's say you're working with a client, you're a developer, and the client says, I want to store not only relational data, but XML data. Mr. or Mrs. Developer, please write an app that works with both. Well, today you're sitting there saying, okay, I got to write to ADO.NET and XPath and something else and XML documents, right? The XML document object library. And what we want to do is we want to make it seamlessly across. Whether you say, okay, I want to integrate those two technologies at the database level, and shred the XML into relational, so you can work with it as relational data or whatever you want to do at that layer. Or you can store it in its native formats, both relational and XML, and kind of combine it at the API level. We see that as being the next generation for SQL Server or data overall at Microsoft.
Now, if there's a developer out there, where should they be going to find out tips, tricks, and information if they want to get involved in databases? Their web forums and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a ton of web forums. I would say SQLjunkies.com is one really great place for you to go and not only get the Visual Studio side of the house, since they run a site for that, but also the SQL Server side of the house. Another good organization is obviously things like PASS, the Professional Association for SQL Server. If you're a hardcore SQL Server developer, PASS is something that you're going to want to join and go to their conference and take a look at that. Other quick things is MSDN. Obviously, we do a lot of investment in MSDN on the SQL Server Dev Center. It now has an RSS feed, so you can go with your favorite RSS reader and see all the new articles.
You can even write your RSS reader and have it storing the information in the SQL Server, right?
Yeah, we actually have a sample that does that.
Oh, okay.
So another sample that we have, since you got me on RSS, I'm going to go down this path, is Data Transformation Services, our ETL tool, our Extract, Transform, and Load tool that shipped with SQL Server 2000. It's been renamed to Integration Services because it actually integrates data from web services as well as the database and flat file and Excel and a whole bunch of things. I divest a little bit here on diverge on for my topic, but we wrote a text mining algorithm for a sample for integration services that works on RSS feeds. So you can say my favorite keywords or whatever you want to say for RSS feeds is SQL Server, and we'll actually text mine all the RSS feeds you point at us, figure out predictively which ones meet your requirements, and only surface those to you. So that's some of when you're dealing with data, predictive analytics is the next big thing, right? You want the system to help you separate the wheat from the chaff, right? You want it to get you the right information at the right time without you having to, as a human, to do work. And so, you got me stuck on the RSS thing. I had to bring it up, but we do have that sample that we'll make available as part of the SQL Server samples. The other thing too is the documentation in the product itself. I have to talk about this. One of the things we did in both Visual Studio and SQL Server Help is we integrated online community search. So when you actually go and search the help files, we'll search SQL Server community sites as well as Visual Studio community sites. Anyone who's a member of the CodeWise community will be able to search across all those sites. So not only do you get our documentation, but let's say you had a problem like I had with the endpoints and you typed in endpoint, you would search third-party sites as well. So that's a great win for developers to be able to find out information that they may not know about and get information from those forums. Plus, you can report back how we're doing. So you can give us suggestions on the product itself through the help.
And the product changes because of that. We've already seen some changes coming during the beta process.
A ton of changes, yeah. We have this technology called Ladybug, which any person who's on the beta or downloads the product can report a bug, and it goes into our standard bug tracking database, and we guarantee you a response, right? Whether it's we already fixed it or whether we're going to fix it. And we found a lot of bugs that we normally wouldn't find through that process. So it's been very, very good. But there's obviously a ton of SQL Server sites out there that are talking about SQL Server 2005. But MSDN and those sorts of sites are the best sites to go to.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate the time you spent on doing these demos and learning a bit about the CLI capabilities and the web services capabilities, and that I could use C# or Visual Basic for writing applications with SQL Server, and also the pointers on some of the different forums and web locations for more information.
All right. Thank you, Robert.
Well, hopefully that gives you information that shows you how easy it is to program using the CLR within SQL Server, so that programmers, whether you're existing database programmers or whether you're existing VB or C# or .NET programmers, can now use a database, SQL Server 2005 specifically, within your applications to provide better solutions to your audience. Thanks for joining us.
With me today is someone from my very own team. John Boylan is a site manager on MSDN. John, welcome.
Hi, Erica.
So John, why don't you talk about what specific site management projects you work on currently for MSDN?
I work on a lot of sites, but the major sites are on the visual tools, C++, C#, and then J#, and even and then Fox Pro, but I do a lot of other content areas as well. Too numerous to mention.
Okay. And so how long have you been at MSDN?
5 years as an employee, and then I was a contractor 1 year before that.
Okay. And you've done just general site management type work
I
there?
started as an editor then, and I edited for a long time, and then I was doing acquisitions, basically finding content to put online. And I've been a site manager managing websites for, I don't know, maybe a year or two now.
Okay. And so what kind of things did you do before Microsoft?
Oh, I was a technical editor for a long time, and I was a freelance writer, and I was also the editor of an art magazine, and I worked in law firms helping produce databases, a bunch of things.
Okay. Is it art magazine something that's still around?
No, it lasted for 10 years. It was called Reflex. It was a major. There have been regional art magazines for a long time, and this was the one for the Pacific Northwest. It covered Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska, but it died in '96, and I don't think anything has replaced it.
Okay. Are you from the Northwest?
I'm from Pennsylvania. I was born in Ohio and grew up in Pennsylvania.
Okay. How long have you been here?
Since 1984, I was traveling in China and came back and didn't want to go back east, so I settled out here instead.
Just stopped on the way?
Yeah, it just stops in the way. I'm still here.
Never went home. That's great. So what are some things you like to do outside of work?
Oh, I have a fairly busy schedule of things. I do a lot of community projects. My most regular project is I organize a series of conversations about art, politics, technology, culture in general. And they're round tables. I get 4 guests, and they come, but it's not a panel. There might be 30 or 40, 50 people in the audience, and we all have a conversation. It's more, and the guests I try to get from varied backgrounds. So, for example, the one that I'm doing in February is about food. So I have a woman who runs one of the best farmers markets in the city, and a woman who used to be an elementary school teacher who's now an organic farmer, and a man who's a cook who's just been through library science school to open up a culinary library. That's his goal in life. He's a chef who will be a librarian as well. And the fourth one is a well-respected poet and painter in the city who has dealt a lot with food. So that'll be the mix of people dealing with issues around food, whether it's food. Scientific issues, food safety, or organic farming issues, or just the pleasure of it.
Mm-hmm. And so now, and then these conversations take place in front of a live audience?
Well, that's just it. There is an audience, but the audience, it's more of a round table. Like I said, maybe 40 people show up, but rather than having a proscenium arch in a theater, the guests are all among the people, or among the audience. So the guests speak first, but then we open it up for a conversation that lasts 2 hours. It can be difficult if the group is too large, because then not everybody gets a chance to talk. But it's wide-ranging, and it's pretty interesting. The 3 that I'm doing this season are, this one's food, and then the second one is on circus. Since circus is a really growing cultural movement in this country. And then the third one will be about power, how power works. I've done them on light and sound, on a variety of topics.
That's cool.
But always with an art, sometimes with a science component.
And how do people find out about them to attend?
Oh, I have a mailing list that goes out to about 500 people, but email is viral. So I know it goes out to about 1,000 people generally through re-emailings, and then I lose count. I'm not sure how many other people see it. I stopped years ago trying to publicize things through the press. Because before email and before the web, when you just sent out news releases, it was hit or miss, and it was abysmal. So being able to rely on the viral nature of the web is quite cool.
Sure, and word of mouth.
Yeah, and then, well, it's like the web is word of mouth.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what are some other things that you're working on outside of work?
Oh, I'm also working with a group of young artists who put together an annual conference for political artists, whether people who artists who work in satirical art, or the very young artists who like to put up stuff that deals with their kind of punk or new wave or grunge or what's later hip hop visions. And that's going to happen in May. Last year we had a conference that had 250 people in it, and they were from all over the country. We had from as far away as New England and New York, DC. And the budget for that, I think, was about $3,000.
Wow.
It was tiny, and we actually broke even through donations and that kind of thing. It was pretty much free, and we fed people for nothing. And I'm also working on writing about a garden. It's a project to do a couple of essays about a complex garden. It's a stunningly beautiful place.
What kind of garden?
It's a garden that is designed by a friend of mine, and it's very conceptual. It's got a lot of complexity, and the owner has been a part of it as well.
Where is the garden located?
North of Seattle,
Okay.
in the country.
And so when do you think your book will be done?
The book about this, I'm not sure. I'm doing some writing for some other people, pretty much.
When you have time amidst all your other myriad of activities.
And I work on some local community culture things, and I'm also trying to learn some tracking skills, but that's a whole other thing.
What is that exactly?
Going in the woods and saying, oh, that was a muskrat, that was a beaver, and it stopped and it was limping. But that's just here and there. There's some amazing people in the Seattle area who do that, and they do it really, really well. They're masters at it. And when you're around them, they can be in the woods and just be able to say, see that little leaf break there? See, there's a little print in there. And you go down and you look, oh my, yes, there is. It's pretty amazing.
They can pinpoint exactly what it was.
Yeah, right.
That's
They're
great.
really good.
That's excellent. Well, John, you're quite the Renaissance man. You have more activities outside of work than you probably currently do at MSDN.
No. MSDN's pretty.
It keeps you busy.
It keeps you busy. It's as you know, MSDN is publishing. I think it's publishing in a way that publishing has never been done before. I mean, the web publishing for the web is you're publishing constantly. It's a cross between a daily newspaper and a magazine and an encyclopedia, and a person. And soon, I mean, ultimately, in the world, the web sites will be personalizable, and they'll be. It's just putting information out in ways that are that's revolutionary. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot of work.
That's true. It's constant.
Yeah.
Constantly changing.
Yeah.
So what are some things about the web that you're excited to see coming up in the future, just in general?
I'm no expert. Not by a long shot. Well, what amazes me, I guess it always has amazed, it's always the most amazing thing is when you're with really, really young people and they know more than anybody who's even a few years older. Mm-hmm. And you say, yeah, I can. No, I gotta move. I gotta move my site to a new server, but my friend's got one. This is kind of like, and this kid's 16, and she's publishing on the web, and doing it with skills that she never learned in college. She's just been doing this stuff. That's always been the most amazing thing about computers. Some of the smartest mm-hmm. computer people are just people who have worked at it for a long, long time. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Well, John, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Erica. I appreciate this.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of The .NET Show.
And stay tuned for our next episode. It's our 50th episode, and we're really excited, so we hope you'll tune in.
And until then, we'll see you on the web.